So, good evening. Hi, welcome. My name is Paige Berger. I'm the marketing and event director at Barrett Bookstore here in Darien, and I'm really so pleased to be here at the Darien Library tonight. As I said, for the first in-person author event. I've been clear there have been a few other in-person events, but the first in-person author event since COVID, so we're just thrilled to be back together. We so value our partnership with Darien Library and the active community that supports this vibrant library. And I want to make sure to thank the annual Friends of the Library campaign who really helped to support these programs and these in-person events. We're so glad to be back together. For most of you, our guest tonight needs zero introduction, but such is the way these things go. We usually start with a little formality, so we're going to start there, and then we're going to relax a bit. I'm going to share up front Amy's formal writerly bio, as I call it, but stay tuned because her past holds many multitudes. Amy Bloom is an author, screenwriter, and teacher. Her titles are many, including Come to Me, a National Book Award finalist, A Blind Man Can See How Much I Love You, nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award, Love Invents Us, Normal, Away, a New York Times bestseller, Where the God of Love Hangs Out, White Houses, and Lucky Yes, a New York Times bestseller. Her stories have appeared in multiple publications, including the Best American Short Stories, the O. Henry Prize Short Stories, the Scribner Anthology of Contemporary Short Fiction, and many other anthologies here and abroad. She's written for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Vogue, Slate, Tin House, and Salon, among other publications, and she's won a National Magazine Award. She is the Shapiro Silverberg Professor of Creative Writing at Wesleyan University. Lucky students, and I'm simply delighted to be here with you this evening. Amy, welcome. Thank you. So, you've given the world a real gift. I was saying this to Pat and Kathleen before you arrived. I don't know how many of you have yet had the privilege of reading In Love, Amy's memoir, but it is really singularly unique in terms of what people are talking about in terms of love and loss and that whole path. And I've listened to a few of the interviews you've done so far, and a lot of it starts with the loss, but I actually am really in love with your love story. I have been in your fiction for many years, and I was so taken with the way you described how you met Brian. So I was wondering if you would start with reading the chapter where you talk about your meeting.
Thank you. I usually say at readings, I miss my dad so much because he would sit in the back and I would no sooner have read 2 sentences than he would stand up waving his pipe and go, "Honey, you're mumbling. No one can hear you." And so you can play the part of Murray Bloom tonight if you like. All right, let's see. Brian and I fell in love the way some middle-aged people in unhappy partnerships and in small towns do. Liberal Democrats in a Republican town, ethnic types in a town full of Northern Europeans, opinionated loudmouths, and people who were willing to man the Durham Democrats' hot dog stand, hot dogs and cider, every September at the fair. I overlooked his bad haircut and aviator glasses. I'm sure he had to overlook my lack of interest in sports and my impatience. Brian could talk about a plastic gazebo or an additional parking lot for the library for hours. We had been walking together since our partners were not walkers, and talking together in public at our local Democrats' breakfast club, and then suddenly talking in private. He said, "I was a 3-sport captain in high school," and I laughed. He said, "It would have been 4 sports, but you can't do lacrosse and baseball." "Is that right?" I said, and he took my hand. He said, "What's your family like?" I said, "Jews from New York." "You?" He said, "Well, we're a football family. We have 3 Heisman trophies in my family." And I said, "What's a Heisman?" And he kissed me. I kissed him back, and sensibly we avoided each other for the next year. After a year and some martinis in New Haven, at the end of the day, he asked me to take a walk with him. He said, "I'm not stupid. I know how this will end. You'll tell me we should not do this to the people we love, or I'll tell you, and we will go back to our lives where we should be. And I will never get over this. Or we blow up our lives and we be together." I just want to say this, he said, before we walk back to our cars, I know who you should be with. Someone rich, someone fancy, some guy your sister finds for you, but I know who you should be with. You should be with a guy who doesn't mind that you're smarter than he is, who doesn't mind that most of the time you'll be the main event. You need to be with a guy who supports how hard you work and who will bring you a cup of coffee late at night. I don't know if I can be that guy, he said, tears in his eyes, but I'd like a shot. We married.
It's a pretty good love story.
It's a
good love story. So I was struck when I read that chapter in particular, that in so much of your work, love plays a central role, and it's ups and downs and all around. It's not straightforward roses and, harps singing. And I'm wondering, as you began to think about crafting this work, how did your love part of the story with Brian, and we're going to get to the loss, play into that process?
Well, I think for me, they are, well, I should say two things. One is that Richard Rhodes, the historian, once said that writers don't find their subject, the subject finds them. And that's how I think it is for me. My only subject is love. I'm the kind of person who at the art gallery, I don't look at the landscapes, I look at the portraits. The only thing that interests me is people. I mean, I do actually garden, but really the only thing that interests me is people. And my kids used to say, Mommy, you only have 4 subjects: sex, love, death, and family. I was like, how many more? That seems like a lot. It seems like quite a bit. And it has continued that way. I wrote the book because Brian said, you need to write about this. People need to think about the end of life. People need to talk about it more. People need to understand what the possibilities are and what the possibilities are not. And so, the book is really for Brian, and that is definitely part of the love story. And also, to me, for better or worse, grief is the price you pay for love. And I think that is true, not just in my memoir and not just for me, but for any living adult, and most of us know that. And I don't mean that anybody is enthusiastic about the bargain, but I think everybody in this room knows that.
So, people who haven't read the book, you got a little taste from that passage that Brian wasn't a shrinking violet, it seems to me, from what I know of him in the text. He seemed to grab life by the horns, really love it. How then did you start to recognize, perhaps, that there was a shift in how he was approaching life? I mean, what were the first signs? And maybe just to back up for a moment, for those who have wandered in here thinking we're having a fiction reading, maybe talking a little bit about Brian's shift from normal everyday life to
the book is really about Brian's developing Alzheimer's in his early 60s, and his decision after his diagnosis to find a way to end his life peacefully and painlessly. That was his goal. And he really never wavered after the diagnosis. He was not a big waverer in general, and this was not an exception. I had an interview the other day in which the interviewer said to me, "So do you think Brian wanted you to write about this for you?" And I'm sorry to say, I laughed out loud. And I was like, no, he wanted me to write about it for him because it was the book he wanted to write and he wasn't a writer. And he said, as he often did, "Oh, you do it, honey." And so I did. I think for anybody who's sort of experienced somebody in their family or their life with Alzheimer's, it's a diagnosis that's most useful in hindsight, right? You look back and you go, oh, that was a real problem. Oh, I didn't understand what was happening then. And so for him, he was an architect. He had taken on a new job that was it was great. It was like a great pre-retirement job. It wasn't going to be too demanding. People were super impressed with him. He got the job like that. But having gotten the job, although the design work was going okay because he had been an architect for a very long time, things like the printer in the office baffled him. You know, he would have to keep asking the administrative assistant week after week. And, you know, sometimes she was busy and sometimes she was nice about it, but not always. And he would come home and go like, I don't, you know, she's just not being very helpful. And I would say, well, what do you need help with? And then he would say, well, the printer seems very complicated. Or it would be asking for some assistance or something. And there just were a number of difficulties that he was having that were very different than anything he had been through before. He also just became, in sort of general, slightly more irritable, which I think now was partially because if you feel that the world around you is shifting, it's frustrating and it's frightening. And so he just became, I remember we had the most sort of devoted and nice electrician. We had, you know, like little fairy lights in the garden. And Brian just kept going out and rearranging them. And then, what do you know, they wouldn't work. And so then we'd call Joe, and Joe would come down repeatedly and fix them. And then he said to me, well, I just don't think Joe's a very good electrician. And I'm like, this guy's been our electrician for 25 years and has saved our ass. I can't even tell you how many times due to interesting interventions with things like the garden lights. And I just thought, oh, that's so odd. They've always gotten along extremely well. And just sort of things began to build up. He would get an email about a book club and he'd just be really annoyed. And I go, what's the matter? And he'd say, oh, they changed the date. You know, or he'd show up for a book club meeting and it would be the wrong time, or he'd go, you know, and it was just, but all of it for me, I think both because who would want to know this? The answer was certainly not me. And the other piece is also, I apologize to the gentleman in the audience, also he's a man. And so, you know, so sometimes it was a little hard to say. He didn't want to, he couldn't, he forgot, he didn't remember being asked. And so you sort of try to work your way around to understanding what it is without coming to a conclusion that you can't bear to come to.
I have to say, I think you mentioned that, you know, you would sort of say, well, you know, he's becoming a middle-aged man, and I can picture these dinners, you know, I have with girlfriends, and, you know, again, apologies to the men. Of course, we talk about all the wonderful things you do, and I really do. I'm married to an incredible man.
All the time.
Home with my children right now, and he's amazing. But, you know, sometimes, oh gosh, I can't believe, you know, and that parrots back to you, right? So were other people saying, yes, of course.
They were, but happily for me, maybe not happily, but luckily for me, a friend of mine said, you are complaining a lot about Brian, because I really didn't complain about him. I knew who I had married. He knew who he had married. I used to say, actually, when we first got married, that 6 days a week I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world, and on the 7th I was sure I would be acquitted. So,
Yeah.
you know, and she said, this isn't what you usually say. And so I began to think a little bit more about the symptoms, but really, it didn't come to anything until he had had hip surgery. He had had hip replacement surgery, and he noticed that he just couldn't keep track of appointments. You know, the physical therapist would come in, and he would always be his sort of warm self up to a point, but clearly didn't remember having seen her 2 days before. And he found it jarring, and I think that was part of it. So we went to his surgeon for whatever it was, the 2-week checkup. And Brian complained the whole time, and also about the memory loss. And the surgeon said, you know, it's possible, it happens sometimes to people after anesthetic that they take a few weeks to get their memory back, but it doesn't seem like it would be you. You're a pretty healthy guy, but maybe. We waited about 2 more weeks, and Brian was like, it's not better. We need to go see a neurologist. So we went.
So fast forward, you go to the neurologist, and the news is not good.
No, the news is not, to me, shocking, but it is terrible. You know, it's like when you see the car bearing down upon you, you're not shocked when it runs over you, but it's still terrible.
I think what struck me as somebody who has not experienced this with an intimate partner or with a close family member is many in this room, I'm sure, have had some experience with some sort of diagnosis that's affected a family member. And what often happens then is they say, okay, so here's the diagnosis, but here's what we're going to do, right? We're going for the chemo, where you're going to take this drug, or we're sending you to another specialist. And what I found really shocking, like jaw-dropping, I both listened to it and the book both times, I thought, I mean, basically they said, well, you should have a couple of blueberries a day and get some more sleep, and that's about it? I mean, is that really, how did that feel, I guess, and also how did that land with Brian? I mean, bring us to that moment, if you will.
Well, I don't know exactly what Brian felt about it. I mean, I think that it was hard to take it in, but we both certainly understood that there was no treatment that was being offered. I mean, absolutely, we have this experimental drug. You might want to try this. Or some people have had luck with that. Or if Brian would like to be in a clinical trial, that would put him at the front of the queue if they ever have treatment for this. I mean, I'm sure they expect to have it. I'm sure they will have it someday. And we just went home and spent the weekend crying. And, you know, I just said to my kids, we're just, don't call. We're just going to be crying. And at the end of that weekend, he said, you know, I heard what the doctor had to say, and you heard it. And we had both seen Alzheimer's close up in our families. And he said, this is not for me. He said, you know how I am. I should also say, he was like a big guy. He was a football player at Yale. He was a hard man to stop. And he said, I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. I know what this looks like. I am not doing this. Because the doctor was very clear that his body could certainly, he was a very healthy guy, his body could certainly last another 10 years. But she was also equally clear that he had probably had Alzheimer's for at least the past 3 years at a minimum, which is usually the case when you get around to getting diagnosed. And that there was no treatment. And he said, I am not doing this. He said, and you love me and you're going to help me. And he was right.
So you're going to help him.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to imagine, and you describe it a bit, he would like to have a say in how he passes. He would like to control that piece of it and not have it be a long, drawn-out process. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we had, you know, I mean, if you have Alzheimer's in your family, you know what it looks like. You know, we had gone to the memory care unit and we had spent time with, you know, somebody who had been a very glamorous, I have to say we didn't agree about politics, but we were really as one on the subject of fashion, she and I. I used to call her our Nancy Reagan aunt because she, I mean, you know, I would, you know, she would come visit and I wasn't inappropriately dressed, but glamorous is not the word that would come to mind. And this woman would come downstairs for breakfast at 8:30 in the morning in like a St. John's suit and a throw and the hair and the amethyst earrings with the matching ring and the bracelet and the pin. And I'm like, and then I sometimes would have to go back upstairs and change just so I could pour her a cup of coffee. And to see her, you know, in this memory care unit, desolate and lost and miserable and so far from anything she would have wished for herself, made a big impact on both of us. And he was like, that is not for me. He said, I do not want not to know the grandchildren. I do not want to be a shell that people have to take care of. That's not what I intend. I want to be myself in my life. I want people, what he said, I want people to miss me, not to be relieved that I am gone. So
he tasks you. He sounds like he was very clear always in his likes and dislikes and
He was very
orders.
clear.
And so it seems to me that he said, "This is your project. Go." So what do you do? I mean, I will say, before I read the book, I thought you could go to Oregon or Vermont, maybe one of those states, where you can go.
not the case.
So apparently not the case. So do you Google? I mean, what is
Yeah.
this? You sit down at your desk, and how do you begin this process?
Well, I know how to Google, and my parents were very much afraid when I was graduating from high school because I didn't want to go on to college. I mean, I was not going on to college, that no good would come of that, and so they made me go to Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School, which did actually serve a real purpose, so I can take notes like crazy. I'm only sorry that they don't have dictaphones anymore, so I can show off my skills. But yeah, you Google. And very quickly you get through the first, this is what I tell my students, Google is great for a beginning. And then you need to come to some other understanding. But all of it is on the internet. All of it is on the internet. Every weird thing, every useful thing, every useless thing, every semi-factual thing. But, I know how to read. And, as you sort of work your way through the layers, it becomes clear that that there are certainly nonprofit organizations in America which advocate for better education, which advocate for palliative care, which advocate for legal change. But there is certainly, what I had been looking for was like, oh, where can we go? Will we get an Airbnb in Vermont? And then you read and you see that the right to die laws are in fact designed. There's no question when you look at the laws and how they repeat the same language and the same strictures, they are designed to be a very narrow eye of the needle. It is not designed to make this kind of physician-assisted death, or as they have in Canada in a lot of circumstances, although again not for dementia. It is not designed to make it available. It is designed to make sure that fewer than 100 people a year can pass through the eye of that needle. You have to have 2 physicians in the state, right? So you've just picked up from Connecticut and, okay, honey, let's try Oregon. You go to Oregon, you have to find the 2 physicians who will assess you and announce that you have 6 months, no more than 6 months to live, absolutely. Then you have 3 interviews usually, 2 oral and in person, 1 in writing. You think about what this means for people with various disabilities at the end of their lives or in the middle of a debilitating disease. And then there's a 15-day waiting period, which they have waived now in a couple of states. Oh, you also have to become a resident of that state. And then it is possible that a doctor whom you have to find will prescribe a lethal dose of medication which you yourself need to be able to take on your own. I'm like, this does not sound like a lot of people who are in serious trouble with an ongoing illness. So that's what I discovered. And then as I sort of worked my way through the wormhole, I came across Dignitas, and now there are actually 2 agencies like this. This is a nonprofit organization in Switzerland. There's Dignitas, which has been around for about 25 years, and Pegasus, which is sort of an offshoot from a couple of doctors who had worked at Dignitas. And they are probably within 100 miles of each other, and they're both in Switzerland. And part of that is because in other European countries, they have physician-assisted suicides. They have physician-assisted death. And so if you are a resident of Belgium or the Netherlands, you can find a doctor and you can make those arrangements. And Switzerland is the only country that will allow people who are not Swiss to come and do that.
So Dignitas it is, but that process was also not, it wasn't like you found it and the angel sang and you said, this is our solution. And And in fact, I will say the chatter behind the counter at the bookstore was a lot about the requirement that the person could not show signs of depression.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, that was it. It was like, okay, hold on. I've been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, but it has to be very clear that I'm not depressed at all.
Right, that you're in blithe spirits. Yeah, so what they really mean is that you cannot have a history of clinical depression. What they're trying to avoid is people who have been looking towards suicide as an ending for just, sort of mental health struggles. They don't in any, and so what they're distinguishing between is sort of a clinical ongoing depression and the completely understandable and natural depression in response to a terrible diagnosis. So that's what they mean. They don't mean you're in a bad mood. They mean they don't want people who've been struggling with issues around this for their whole lives.
Okay. So what else in the process? Give us just an overview. What did that look like? You found it. You shared it with Brian, I assume.
He was
how?
like,
Okay. That was.
I describe him in the book at one point as being like a certain kind of CEO. He didn't want any meetings that were below his pay grade. He wanted regular updates, and he wanted to hear that we were making progress. And most of the time, I could deliver something like that. And I think for me, although it was, it was terribly hard and very lonely, the thing that did feel a little bit better was that he felt that things were going the way he wanted them to. He felt like we were making progress, and he was not frightened. I just lived in terror that this would not work out, but I didn't share that with him. So his neurologist, unfortunately, listed on his MRI form that the reason for the MRI was clinical depression, which was not true. And it was just carelessness on her part. It was literally nothing more than carelessness. But for us, that put Dignitas out of our reach immediately. And when I spoke to the very nice lady at Dignitas, who I kept referring to as in the book as Heidi, because it was the only Swiss name I could think of, but that wasn't her name. And she basically said, "This will not do. This is the thing that will make us say no. So you have to get another neurologist or a psychiatrist to rebut this diagnosis." And I called her office, the neurologist, and said, maybe this was just like an error because, in fact, he doesn't have clinical depression. You can see that there's no medical history of depression whatsoever. She was like, "Oh, it's not a big deal." I'm like, well, I don't feel that way. And I sort of pressed her a little bit on it, and she said, "I'm not changing it. It's what I wrote. It's already been approved. He's already had the MRI. I'm not going to say I was wrong." I thought, certainly not. And that left us scrambling for several months. Although I will also say, as angry and as scared as I was, it led us to have more time. And that was a good thing, mostly. And eventually, the guy who was my therapist, who I refer to in the memoir, is the great Wayne. His name was Wayne. Said, "If you would like, I will do a long interview with Brian." And this is a guy who's been a psychiatrist for 55 years. He said, "And I will assess him, and I'll give you the assessment. And if it suits your needs, you can send it to Dignitas. And if it does not, I'm sorry." And he did the interview, and he must have spent 2 hours with Brian. And it was also, for me, having been a clinical social worker, a real master class in interviewing. I mean, I could just see him taking Brian sort of through various memory paths where he had some difficulties and other pieces where he didn't have difficulties. And in the end, he said, this is somebody who doesn't suffer from clinical depression. He absolutely knows what he wants to do. He absolutely understands the implications. He is completely prepared for this. This is, a courageous and determined man, and there would be no reason for him not to be able to proceed. And that is what saved the day for us. And so people from Dignitas were very receptive, and that's where we went from there.
The Great Wayne is one of many supporting characters
Yeah.
in your book. And so obviously so much of the book does talk about what you and Brian went through, but can you tell us a little bit how you approached sort of widening that circle out once the decision was made, once you had been accepted? How did you then start to share that with family and friends and maybe share one of those two reactions?
Well, we were very lucky, I think. My mother-in-law, who was and is a devout Catholic, astonished me by being 100% supportive. This is also her friend, the Nancy Reagan fashion plate, who was our aunt, who suffered from Alzheimer's. And I remember telling Yvonne, and we were sitting actually in our guest bedroom, it was before Brian was up, and she said, I prayed about this all night. And she said, I am so relieved. She said, thank you for helping him. And I would not ever want him to suffer the way my friend has suffered. She said, once you see this, you cannot think that this is all right, or what anybody would wish. And so she was great, and I said, we're not quite ready. Brian had a large family. I said, we're not quite ready to tell the siblings. And she said, so that's fine. It's your story to tell. You do what you want. I said to her, well, I know it must be hard to keep a secret. She sort of snorted, which is not her style either. And she said, I'm 84. I know how to keep a secret. I was like, okay, fair enough. And you widen the circle a little bit. Everybody has to make their own decisions about this. I think that people feel a great deal of anxiety. I had a very close friend whose business partner was diagnosed with Alzheimer's very young, in her 50s. And her friend and the friend's husband had discussed this and had planned, actually, to go to Dignitas within the year. She had already had symptoms for about 5 years. And she told her sister, and her sister called her husband and said, if you do this, I will prosecute. And I want you to know that. And her friend lived for another 15 years with Alzheimer's. So I know that people have understandable anxieties about this. For us, in our family circle and close friends, some people were more able to be supportive. For other people, it stirred up a lot of anxiety and distress, and I certainly understand that. But overall, I think we felt certainly supported.
One of my favorite lines in the book from Brian, when you were not quite at the Dignitas stage yet and you were researching and sort of saying, oh, maybe we'll do it with pills, but then I have to be away because, if I'm by your bedside, then I could go to jail. And what did he say to you about that?
I said, honey, this is hard because I could be prosecuted for your murder. And he was like, huh. And then he said, you'd be great in jail. You're such a leader. You're so resourceful. And I appreciated that.
It really shows what you're made of. Think about you. I have to ask, and I know this is difficult, so with respect, in the aftermath, I couldn't help when reading it but note the timing of his passing and your return. And in the book you said you sort of had this vision. You would return to the house and climb into bed for 2 weeks and not speak to anyone. And then the house sort of came alive as a character. Apparently your house had another idea. Everything was breaking and the lights were on.
That was very funny. Yeah. When I came back from Zurich, and my daughters were both waiting for me. And everything in the house blew. I mean, it really did. I mean, the dishwasher, the washing machine, the dryer, the fridge, all the lights on the third floor, which is where our bedroom was, everything blew. And so I'll share something about myself, which I think seems somewhat incongruous because I'm such a rationalist. But so I have an excellent tarot card reader. And I call Susie Chang, and I say, Susie, all the appliances have blown. What do you think this means? And she's a very sensible woman. She goes, I think you should get an electrician. I was like, oh, okay. And then I called her about 2 weeks later just to sort of check in. I said, I'm just thinking about Brian, dreaming about him a lot. And I said, not really like an afterlife kind of gal, but I said, like, has he become like he was a big fisherman, big fly fisherman. I said, has he become like a salmon? And she said in the flattest voice, the voice you use on severely mentally ill people, she goes, that's not a thing. And I had expected to sort of crawl into bed and be done with the world, which it's not really my nature, but that's sort of what I had hoped for, I think. And it is the beginning of the pandemic at that time, and my daughter and her wife and the baby call me from Brooklyn and go, they just closed the preschool, and we both have to work full-time from home. And I said, well, get in the car. And so they get in the car, and they ride. You know how it is. Well, for those of you who have kids in Brooklyn, it's like a clown car. You're like, how much can there be in that car? So it's just endlessly exploding in the driveway. Stuffed unicorns, the tricycle, the scooter, the computers. And they stayed with me for 5 months. And I think that was an unbelievable gift. I had not planned to be engaged with the world. And it turned out that it was really a wonderful thing to be in the world, regardless of any, hesitation or trepidation I had about it. The world was coming to me, and it was going to be in my house. And I think that was a tremendous gift.
Brian told you, I think, he wanted you to write this. Is that correct?
Yes,
he wanted you to share his story. So I've heard you say before that, for some writers, the characters come and sit on the end of your bed, and the words just come. And you have said that writing is work. Thank you. Yes, it's work.
Yeah.
It takes work.
Terrible.
How did this work differ than fiction, where you are creating a world, but this was your world that you were putting on the page?
Yeah, I didn't care for that. I'm still not a fan. But I had made notes, mostly actually the way you do when you have a partner who's ill. You got to keep track of the medication, you got to keep track of the appointments, and you don't want them clashing with each other, and also what's going to work, what's not going to work. Oh, you should get B12 supplements. So I had already had notes of sort of the kind that we all have as caregivers, and partially because, so from 8 to about 12:30 or 1, I would take care of Zora, and then her mothers would, they would quit work. They'd put in as long a day as they could put in, and then they would take over. So I would run to my office. So that was mostly to write, but also on account of, I could run to my office and stop singing the wheels on the bus. And the material was there, and I have a pretty good memory. I was a clinical social worker for a long time, and I went to school such a long time ago that you had to learn how to do something called process recording, in which you could write the entire session from memory, from the first topic to the last topic, and how you got there in between. It's great training. It did take up a lot of time. And so, I would just write down different scenes and different things that I recalled, and sort of got to work on it. And it was not like writing a novel in the sense that the characters were all already there, but, a good sentence is a good sentence. And it's still the same thing as trying to string all the scenes together on one chain, so they all flow and they all belong together. You see the shifts in scene and so on. So, I worked at it. It turns out you can cry and type at the same time, and that's mostly what I did. I mean, I wasn't doing a lot. I wasn't doing a lot of other things. It was COVID. And I spent a lot of time babysitting. When I wasn't babysitting, I went and wrote.
So I'd love to open it up for a few questions, and then Amy has kindly agreed to stay and sign. So we have plenty of books available for purchase after, but let's take a few minutes and we'll take some questions. Yes?
I never felt abandoned because as he said, I don't want to leave. He said, but since I have to leave, I would like to do it this way. So I didn't feel abandoned. I mean, I did feel the frustration I felt. I felt much more frustration before he was diagnosed, because even though I was quite sure he had Alzheimer's, just there's to be times that he would be sort of oddly distant, or we would have had a long conversation. But, whether you're married a short time or a long time, if you have a conversation in which, the other person has to say, oh, I see that I hurt your feelings, blah, blah, blah. If they don't remember it the next day, you just can't quite get things aligned right in terms of like the intimacy of the marriage. So that certainly felt frustrating. I felt some anger about the situation, especially when it was so difficult to get some of the help that we needed. But I would say mostly, which is usually nicer for me, it was mostly turned outward. It wasn't turned against Brian. I thought we were both doing the best we could.
Thank you.
I would say it took Brian about 48 hours to accept the diagnosis. He understood that something was wrong. He just, he really didn't know what, but he was the one who said, my memory is just shot. We need to understand what's going on. And it was about 7 months from the diagnosis to going to Switzerland, partially because, we did ask and we did research. Nobody was able to say to him, you have this much time, or you have roughly, nobody, and at one point he said to a friend of his who's a neurologist, if you could tell me I had a couple of good years, and his friend said, nobody knows, and so that was part of the push for him, was that it became very clear to him that if he was going to do this, he had to be sort of really high functioning cognitively. And although he wasn't as aware of his cognitive deficits as I was or as people around him were, but he was certainly aware of it. He was not, when I said to him, I didn't have to say it to him, the neurologist said to him, you can't drive. And he never argued with that. He would make like a very short, like a 5-minute drive to the grocery store, but and then stop that as well. But in some sense, he was always cognitively functioning enough to understand that things needed to move along. Well, what they will say at Dignitas is you need to, the word, it's very Swiss, the word they use is discernment. You need to demonstrate that you understand what is going to happen, you understand the procedure, you understand what the result will be, that you will be dead. You need to be able to provide some sort of biographical statement about why you are seeking this procedure. And you need to be able to have interviews in which you can talk about the illness, talk about your plans, talk about how you've come to this point. Because their goal is to make sure that when you say, they ask you, I cannot even tell you how many times, 50 times when you are there, are you sure this is what you want to do? Please let us know. If at any point you change your mind, we want you to know that we will support you entirely. We will be happy to help you make arrangements to go home. You do not need to do this if you do not wish to do this. And they need to know that the person who is saying, yes, I wish to continue, is in a position to to give informed consent. I appreciate the question. I certainly want to be supportive. If people ask me, I try to give them good advice. I try to suggest which organizations are doing a lot of advocacy, whether it's Compassion and Choices or other organizations. For me right now, I don't feel that the thing I see myself doing is being an activist for this. It's not that I don't think it's important, but like lots of other people in the room, I feel like my time is sort of limited. not just in terms of my interests, but also just like my lifespan. I feel like I got a couple more books I need to write. So I think I will always be supportive of it. I mean, I cannot tell you how many emails I have gotten since the book came out. Hundreds upon hundreds of people either asking questions, and I answer everybody, you know, to try to direct them if I can, or to give them information, or just to hear their story. And it's, you know, lots of people will say, my mother had this, it was terrible, I worry about this, you know, how can I try to move this forward? And, you know, it's going to take a lot of people talking about this to change the premise of the laws in this country, because the premise of the laws is, let's make sure people don't do this. Not let's make sure people don't suffer. Let's make sure people cannot take control of their own death. I don't know if people could hear the question on here. No, not at all. What she asked me, besides saying nice things about the book, what she asked me was that I had, you know, in the book there are sort of portraits of some of the people who were really central to the story. You know, my sister, my mother-in-law, Great Wayne, and were there people who disappointed me or did not respond? I think, well, here's what I've discovered at my age, that people are not perfect. And don't tell too many other people. And they are disappointing sometimes. And even when they do their best, sometimes they're disappointing. So yeah, I mean, and sometimes, I mean, I remember at Brian's memorial service thinking, you know, people are going to do their best and they are going to say idiotic things. And I am going to let it be. I'm not going to be mad at these people. You know, they are presumably not making an effort to be idiots. You know, it's just a thing that's happening. And, you know, so that when people say things like, I'm sure he had a few more good years. Or a friend of his who wrote to him, and this actually did make me laugh, even though I was so mad. And it was very interesting because for Brian, even with the Alzheimer's, sometimes like being really angry would really clarify his thinking. So he gets this email from an old friend who goes, don't make any decisions now. I've Googled Alzheimer's, and here's my understanding. And Brian just, you know, wrote back, you know, sort of pulled himself together and said, all we're interested in hearing at this point is support and encouragement. And that was sort of our line with people, which is like, you are absolutely entitled to your opinion. What we are looking for is support and encouragement. If you don't feel that you can provide that, that's okay. We love you. We're not here for that. But, you know, everybody, you know, mostly people do their best, and sometimes it's not great, you know.
Well, thank you, Amy. Thank you to all of you for coming. We're so delighted, as we said, to be back here with the Darien Library. We have plenty of books for sale. If you give us a few moments, we're going to set Amy up at the signing table, and you can purchase them over at with Yvette, and then have a quick chat with Amy. But thank you. Thank you.